All right. Go. Good evening or morning, afternoon for anybody tuning in here after the fact. I am working on getting set up here. Good evening. Getting a fun little instrument set up here for tonight's program. I think that's going to work. Going to get to that in just a little bit. It's a sort of a unique noisemaker. But I think that's all set and ready to go. We'll call it a theoretical possibility, but it works pretty well, and likely something like it existed. We'll talk about that in a bit. I have just another minute or two. See if anybody else is gonna make it on tonight, and we'll go ahead and get started. You can see we're still sitting in the Ice Age section here. We've got a really neat program for tonight. It's a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about music. Now, so we'll give just another minute here. We'll get started. Most everything we're going to be going over tonight is it's actually going to be stuff that you can make at home. And when we get to the end, we'll show you something that you can absolutely make at home that you wouldn't have quite been able to make in the Stone Age, at least not the way we're going to show it here. So I'll go ahead and kick things off. If anybody hops in, we can catch them up. So first off, thank you for joining me here this evening at Colossal Fossils up here in Wausau, Wisconsin. We really appreciate everybody coming to the programs. My name is Sean, and well, if you haven't met me in a previous program, I am Colossal Fossils experimental archaeologist, which means I spend a lot of time hanging out in the Stone Age and making and using Stone Age tools and technologies, things like a little knife here. And well, I take this stuff, I make it based on replicas, based on artifacts that our ancient ancestors left behind, and then I go out into the real world with this stuff and I use it. I actually go camping dressed up like this to see how well the clothes work and how well the tools, the friction fire works, and so on. Now, a lot of the stuff that we talk about, that we think of when we're talking about ancient peoples are, of course, stone tools. We get the Stone Age because the stone artifacts are the things that preserve. The spear shaft, for example, that's attached to the point doesn't preserve, it doesn't last, it rots away, but the stone pretty much lasts forever. So when we think of ancient peoples, we have a kind of a tendency to imagine them as always hunting and only making tools out of rocks and that sort of thing. But in fact, our ancient ancestors had quite a lot of creativity and quite a lot of time to make and invent and do new things. Now, a very long time ago, way before we were people, people started using stone tools. Millions of years ago, as far back as maybe even 3 million years ago at this point. We keep finding older and older artifacts. Somewhere around 1.5 million years ago, our evolutionary predecessors, Homo erectus, learned how to take control of fire. Now, these are very important steps toward becoming human. Now, much more recently, within the last 50,000 years or so, we have good evidence that people are doing other things that are, well, very human, but not necessarily as practical as, say, a cutting edge or a fire. It's art. You know, cave art, things like this painted on cave walls, and even on engraved into pieces of bone or carvings into stone or clay, showing that people are expressing themselves through images. Well, right about that same time period, we start to find actually fairly complex musical instruments, some things we're going to be talking about tonight. Music is one of those things that, like cave art, it's kind of hard to imagine it being a tool. It's well, for us today, painting or music is really, it's an artistic expression. But our ancient ancestors did some neat things with this artistic expression. Now, before we delve too deeply into that, music, the subject of tonight's program, is defined by the dictionary as sounds of vocal or instrumental origin that are combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion. Now, what that means is that they're noises that are combined together to sound pretty, or to sound nice, to sound appealing. And that's music. It's art. You know it when you hear it. Now, music is, of course, different for different people, different cultures, different regions. It's incredibly varied. It's one of those limitless things that if we can produce it, then there's somebody else who's going to like the sound of it. I personally enjoy classical music, but every once in a while I get into the mood for bluegrass or something like that too. It varies a lot. My cave wife back at home in the hut kind of likes 80s rock ballads and pop music, stuff like that. It varies a lot from person to person. Now, music is, well, by definition, made of sound. Sound is just simply a vibration. It is a wave of energy moving through, in most cases, the air, the atmosphere. But of course, it can travel through water or solid walls, that sort of thing too. But it is the production of energy in a wave form that vibrates the atmosphere. And those vibrations, like as I'm speaking here, the microphone picks them up and translates them through the internet, sends them to your computer speakers at home, and you hear what I'm saying. The sound I am producing, or your computer is producing, is actually vibrating. It's rattling the atmosphere. And the movement of the atmosphere actually vibrates what we call a tympanic membrane. It's your eardrum. And that physical movement inside your head is what you hear. It's how you sense the sound. Without that process being possible, we couldn't make music. Now, when music was invented, when it first came to be a thing, is something we'll probably never know for sure without a time machine. It's kind of lost to the distant foggy past. By way of the fossil record, we know that at least 500,000 years ago, early human ancestors, like Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, this group, they had what we call a hyoid bone. It's a kind of a U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped bone in your throat that allows your vocal cords to produce the sounds that we use to talk and to sing. So we know they had the capacity to sing. That's far enough back that our close relatives, Denisovans and Neanderthals, probably also had the capacity for music. We actually think Neanderthals were musical. We've got some of the Neanderthal musical instruments to talk about too. So music has been something that's been around for a very long time. The complex instruments we find only go back about 40 to 50,000 years are not just all of a sudden bright ideas that somebody had. The basis for that inspiration, the reason behind making those instruments was around for a very long time. Now, today we think of music as entertainment, something fun, right? When you're happy, you're having a good time, you sing. When you go to somebody's birthday party, you sing happy birthday. But throughout history, music has had other purposes. And in some cases, we can see little shadows of that in music today. But, well, for example, religion. If you go to church, there's usually a choir in church, right? People singing the hymns and prayers. Music has been used in spiritual and religious ceremonies across cultures for, well back into prehistory. Music, of course, is fun. It brings the group together. Everybody's sitting around the campfire, playing the caveman band and singing. Everybody's having a good time. It builds cohesion, it bonds, it helps everybody get along, and it passes time. We use it to pass time on long road trips. Our ancestors would have used it to pass time over those cold ice age winters while it's blizzarding outside the hut. But more importantly, music has been used for a very long time to pass on oral histories, to teach, to tell stories. Now, in ancient Greece, the Bronze Age, all the way up into the Middle Ages, great epic poems, stories of heroes like Achilles or Hercules, for example. They would sing the song of that hero. The poems, the epic poems, the stories that we have written record of would have actually been sung by a storyteller, usually with an instrument or somebody else playing music to go along with the story, to add to it, to make it more memorable. In the Middle Ages, knights and shining armor would have had what we call a bard, somebody who would sing the tales of their victories and make them look extra fancy. Just follow them around and talk about how great they are, but to music. Even further back, music was even used as a map. Now, in Australian Aboriginal cultures, and Australian Aborigines are dozens and dozens of groups of people across the entire continent of Australia. Australian Aborigine is kind of a blanket term like Native American, but across these cultures, they have a practice, a tradition called songlines. And this is a sort of a variation on the use of music to create an oral history. They have a very interesting use for it. They actually sing maps. Now, this is a practice that's probably very, very ancient and could actually go back to the very beginnings of humanity, well before there were Australian Aborigines or even in Australia. And the instruments that they use when they're doing this are often things that could be just as ancient. Of course, the didgeridoo is a well-known Australian instrument. I do not have one, nor am I particularly good at playing one. So I'm going to say we're all lucky. I'm going to spare everybody that tonight. But an instrument that they use that's actually a universal instrument is what we call clapsticks. That's really just simple sticks. Now, these are two sticks that I collected from my backyard, just for the demonstration, for the point. And all they're doing with them is smack them together. And you get a good, sharp clack out of them. It's louder than you can clap your hands. And of course, if you clap your hands for a while, they get sore. The sticks don't get sore. Now, the clapsticks are a very important part of how the song lines work. These song lines are sometimes called dreaming tracks. They allow the storyteller, the singer, to explain their experiences, their travels in such a way that somebody who's never been on that path, who's never followed on that journey, can imagine it very much like they were actually there. And these songlines get so detailed in some of these Aboriginal cultures that they have essentially an oral tradition of mapping the entire region, even across language barriers and into the homelands of other Aboriginal tribes around them. They can use these songlines to teach the next generation where everything is and how to get there. And in fact, what the experience of getting there was like by the way they sing it. Now, we imagine this happening in an Ice Age environment, say an Ice Age cave in Central Europe. Our ancestors are sitting there in the cave, it's blizzarding outside, and they're talking about where they're going to travel to go hunting, say. They've got their clap sticks, or perhaps because in the Ice Age in some places, sticks could be hard to find because trees, rib bones, and interesting thing about clap sticks and rib bones, if we found these lying on the floor of a cave, we wouldn't necessarily recognize them as being there for musical purposes. We would just think they're leftovers from barbecue, right? Or even antlers, like what I use for flint knapping, for creating stone tools. You give a really good sound, and all you need is a couple of folks creating a beat like that, and you've got the beginnings of your music. Now, I'm going to spare everybody me trying to sing because, well, some people are blessed with musical talents. I myself am not much of a singer. Much better with a pen and pencil than I am with my voice. So the way this would work, though, you have your storyteller talking about how they're going to go out for the hunt the next sunny day, right? They're going to start out in the morning, walking out of camp with the rising sun to their left shoulder, right? And as they're telling this, they're walking out of camp with the rising sun on their left shoulder, striking out over the plains. They're going through the snow. And the clapping, the clapsticks here are giving us the pace. This is each click is a footstep through the snow, through the open fields. We're crossing the Mammoth Step. We're heading out, the rising sun going up over our left shoulder. And we go for a half a day at this pace until the rising sun is now in front of us and a little overhead. Because it's winter, the sun doesn't get very high in the sky. And at that point, we come up on a hill that's just off to our right side. So we turn right and we follow the sun through the afternoon toward that hill. And we get to the hill and we're climbing up the hill because it's a steep, icy, snowy hill. It's slower going. We get to the top of that hill and we stop. Now we can look around and see that landscape, and we can see down the hill another half day to toward the setting sun is water, and there's always animals at water. So we head down the hill following the setting sun, and we're going down the icy hill, so it's faster. And we get back down to the bottom of the hill, and we travel across that open tundra, the Mammoth Steppe, following the setting sun for another half day. And we get to water and we stop. That's where we camp for the night. And while we're there, we eat a muskrat and have a drink of water. And if you've never been on that journey, you've never left the cave and gone to the hill where you can see the landscape and then gone to water and found food and water and a good place to camp, you would know how to get there by remembering that story and retelling it with the same rhythm. By using a process like that, our ancestors, it's like the Australian Aborigines, could communicate very detailed descriptions of the landscape, of landmarks, of places where they found food, where they found stone to make tools, where they found resources, a cave where they sheltered from a storm, or another village where they met Cave Wife when she was just across the river gal, that sort of thing. And by doing that in a song, into a rhythm, you can explain to people who've never been there how to get there, how long it took, how far it was, how fast you had to travel, all in the same song. It's very likely that that sort of thing is sort of the origin of much of the music that we know and love today. Now, when it comes to the instruments themselves, our ancient ancestors weren't limited to just hitting sticks and bones together. They actually got very creative, came up with some really neat stuff. We're actually going to go through some of these. Now, of course, the clapsticks are absolutely the easiest thing to go out and pick up and find. And in fact, they didn't necessarily have to be just specifically for musical instruments. This is my digging stick. This is actually for digging up roots and tubers. And, you know, it gives a good sound. It works really well. As we mentioned, rib bones, antlers, things like that work great. And the nice thing about rib bones as a musical instrument is that when you get yourself a meal, say a big fat camel or a nice juicy bison, you've got brand new rib bones to make your musical instruments out of. If you're a really, really tough, strong hunter and a little bit braver than I am, you could maybe even get some saber-toothed cat rib bones or cave bear rib bones. And musical instruments do show up that were made out of bear bones. I'll talk about those in a minute. Next up from clapsticks, from just simple sort of percussion, are actually instruments we'll recognize today, rattles. Now this is a birdhouse gourd, and this is just simply a gourd off of the plant that's been dried, but it's full of seeds. And with a little bit of a shake, those seeds make a good rattle. This actually gives you a good bit of rhythm for your caveman band. And this is just a simple unmodified gourd. You know, if we found this at an archaeological site, we would think food, maybe they were going to carve it out and use it for a spoon. If we just found a piece of it or a seed, we would have no idea that it was intended for a musical instrument. Well, of course, other variations of that, these are actually deer hooves. Now, these are very common in North America as something that you would actually tie onto clothing for sort of fancy clothing for dance ceremonies, where if you're, and again, doing like a religious ceremony, where your movement takes the hooves and actually turns your clothing into the musical instrument. Things like this would be quite common. Decorations, very similar styles show up made out of seashells and hooves and bone beads in many, many places. Again, this wouldn't necessarily be thought of as a musical instrument. If you found a couple of these with holes in them, you might just think they're for decoration, and they were used for that too. Of course, a rattle is a very simple thing to make. In this case, just a coconut with a couple stones in it, and you've got your musical instrument. Again, more of a rhythm, less of a music, but rhythm is very important to this early music. It's where it all starts. Now, getting a little bit more complicated, we can, of course, recognize this. Now, this is a drum. This is a very simply made, easy to do style of drum. It's a split of wood that's been soaked in water and heated up over a fire to bend around into a circle. When it's bent, it's tied, it's just lashed together. until it cools, so it'll stay bent into a circle. Then we take untanned leather, what we call rawhide, very much like what you'd give a pet dog as a dog chew, and we stretch it out over that frame on the top and the bottom on both sides. They actually use rawhide to stitch it into place. And when that happens, it puts that membrane, that hide, under tension so that when we hit it, it vibrates. Now, this is a small drum. Of course, drums today are all different sizes. This would be a very easy to carry, very portable musical instrument to take with when you go camping. But the neat thing about drums is that it gives us an ability that other percussion instruments we've been talking about don't really have. Yeah, I can get different sound depending on where I hit this and how I hold it. That is a very important feature to musical instruments, like what we would think of today. On a larger version of this, you can actually get enough variation to play songs on. Now, getting into the last 50,000 years, things start to get really interesting. Now we're pretty, how do I want to say it? We're pretty much certain that by 50,000 years ago, rhythm, rattles, drums, clapsticks, and the voice were all being used to create music. But somewhere back there, somebody came up with a really neat new invention. And at first they were very simple. This is just a small piece of a bone, or a small hollow piece of bone from a piece of pork, from a ham. And it's got a little groove, a little notch cut on the front of it, on the top here. And makes a whistling sound. Now this very first version, it's very, very simple. It only plays one note. An interesting thing about this, a single note flute, you wouldn't think would be terribly useful for music. Even today, there are cultures in the Central Africa and the Congo rainforests called pygmies. And pygmies have a flute, a specific type of music that's kind of unique to them. This flute only plays one note. But the way they make music with it is that they use it sort of as a rhythm. So they'll and in between that note that they play on the flute, they'll sing another note. So I can get the right spot on it again. Ha, 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 ha. Like I said, I'm not going to offend anybody's ears by trying to be truly musical, but by doing that and actually adding some percussion, they will sing a complete song. A couple of them in a group with different toned flutes singing together actually makes surprisingly good music with just a single note musical instrument. But of course, our ancient ancestors were not to be held back by something as simple as the limitations of a single note. And before you know it, we start to see whistles that are a little bit more complicated. Now, this one is made out of a chicken bone. Now, this is a chicken leg. It was barbecue. It was delicious. I ate this for dinner, cleaned out the bone, and used stone tools to carve it up. Now this one has the same notch as the pig bone, but those two holes allow me to change the tone, to change the note that it plays. too bad for a chicken. And we actually have examples of those particular types of whistles made out of the bones of auroch and out of the bones of cave bears, much larger examples like this that were found at sites that we believe are Neanderthal sites. Now it's possible, so we know that early humans and Neanderthals did interact with each other, that Neanderthals learned from people how to make these. It is actually possible that people learned from Neanderthals how to make them, or even that one or the other traded the musical instrument. It's very hard to know where it originated specifically, but we know that both groups were in places where we find instruments like this. Now this will have a slightly different sound. This one's a little bit trickier to play because of its size, but I'm going to give it a shot here. I think that has a really nice sound to it for just a leg bone with a couple of holes in it. Now, move forward just a little bit in time, and over a few thousand years, these instruments get very, very complex relative to their humble beginnings. We start to find much longer versions of them, made out of the wing bones of large birds like vultures and swans, and a little bit later, actually carved out of woolly mammoth tusk, mammoth ivory. Now, unlike a bird bone, like our chicken leg here, that's hollow, or the piece of bamboo that I made my version of out of here, because believe it or not, woolly mammoth tusk is a little tough to get. Mammoth tusk is not hollow. Now with this bamboo, I can take my sharp rock and I can cut off the ends, and it's already hollowed out. All I have to do is put the holes where I want them and carve what we call the embouchure, the piece that you blow across here, that's just sort of a sharp edge, and it's ready to go. This only took me a couple of hours to make, but the people who made these out of woolly mammoth tusk, not only did they have to go and get the mammoth tusk, and I'd say Herbie back there is not going to part with those tusks without a little bit of an argument. They had to carve a strip out of those tusks. They're as big around as a soda bottle. They had to take and shape that into a comfortable shape to smooth it out, polish it. Then, using a drill made a long stick with a sharp piece of stone on the end, they had to drill out that entire piece over its length without making a mistake and drilling too far off one way or the other and boring a hole in the wrong spot. Then they had to take that hollowed out tube of ivory and carve that into a flute, all without making a mistake. Modern reproductions done with stone tools and ancient mammoth tusk have taken researchers more than 220 hours to produce. That means that sometime during the Stone Age, 40,000 years ago, somebody spent 2 or 3 hours a night next to the campfire all winter long making this musical instrument. That is as much time as you will spend doing homework for an entire school year, maybe even more. That tells us music meant a lot to these people. Now, in my mind, the neatest thing about this, when we make a reproduction of those flutes, like this one, when we figure out where the holes go and how long they were, and try to make one that sounded like those original artifacts, those original pieces, we find that they're using the same musical notes that we use in all music today. So already by 40,000 years ago, music as we understand it today is established, it's understood, it's used. We have no idea what their music sounded like. We can guess and sort of theorize based on what music of hunter-gatherers and sort of uncontacted groups and tribes sounds like and how it's used, but really the only way to know what they were playing on these flutes is to hop in a time machine and go back and get a ticket to the caveman band. Now, flutes are among the most complicated of ancient instruments that we find out of the Stone Age, but it's distinctly possible that that's just because of the materials that some of them were made out of. Bone and ivory, mammoth tusk are very tough materials, and even in not quite ideal circumstances, they can preserve quite well. Wood and plant fiber materials, woven bags and baskets, gourd containers, things like that really do not preserve well for tens of thousands of years. So our next instrument here is based on much more recent artifacts, much more recent finds, but it is extremely likely that something equivalent existed a very, very long time ago. So this is a semi-theoretical Ice Age gourd tar. Now, it's a terrible pun. It's a guitar made with a gourd, so a gourd tar. This is actually a variation on an instrument that's even still used today in some places called a mouth bow. And the bow itself, though I suppose I could shoot something very light and small with this, it's not meant to be shot like a bow and arrow. It's meant to hold tension on this string. Now the string itself here is made out of sinew, out of tendon, same kind of stuff that I'd make, say, fishing line or a bow and arrow string or out of, or even sewing thread for seams like on my headband here. It's a very strong material and it deals with the tension very well. It's actually processed from tendons, from animal tendons, in this case, deer. And to help it hold together, because it gets a lot of rough use here, it's been very heavily waxed, which is why it has sort of a yellowish tinge to it. We used natural beeswax. The gourd is, well, the same type of gourd, just a slightly different shape as our gourd rattle here, but this one's been hollowed out. The end of the bow has been put through a small hole in the bottom, and the string has been strung over the top. Now, the way a mouth bow works, I would take this bow and press one end of it against my leg and actually bite down on the end here and pluck that string. And then I'd use my mouth as a resonance chamber, sort of an amplifier for the sound of that vibration. And then by pushing or pulling on the bow as I'm plucking it, I can actually change the tone. I can play different notes on this, very much like the flute. Now, with the gourd, I can save my teeth and still play the same thing the same way. I press the end of the bow on my leg and pluck it up here. Now, this also gives me a couple of options as an ancient musical instrument. I can be my own rhythm section. As you can see, I have very little rhythm, but by pushing and pulling with my arm here on this end, I can adjust the tone. That actually allows me to play complete songs with this very simple musical instrument. That was pretty bad, I give you, but hopefully you could make out what I was going for there. If we found parts of an instrument like this in a cave 50 or 60,000 years old, there wouldn't likely be enough of it left to recognize as a musical instrument. But these types of instruments, they show up in a lot of places and they're very simple to make with Stone Age tools and technology. You can see how a couple of these and a couple of clapsticks and one or two of those flutes could make a really complete Stone Age sound. Now, a musical instrument that we do have very good evidence for that does show up all over the world is actually one of my personal favorites, something called a bull roarer. Now, this is a fairly easy musical instrument to make. It's a paddle. Varying size, they can be up to 2 feet long, 6 to 8 inches wide. This one is about 3 inches across and a foot long. This is the size I usually go for. This is based on an artifact that's more than 15,000 years old. It was made out of caribou antler. This particular one's made out of wood. And the original was very highly decorated. It was carved with a cross-hatching pattern, what we call a basket weave pattern, actually made to look like it was woven. And then it was painted red with red ochre, the same color I used for my little mammoth buddies up here. The way this instrument is played is that we swing it around overhead. And as it's swinging, the paddle is shaped like an airfoil. It's round on top and flat on the bottom. So it starts to twirl. That twirling action vibrates the string, and very much like the gourd tar over there, it produces a sound. The weight of the paddle pulling on the string keeps it taut, and depending on the speed that you're spinning and how hard you're swinging it, you can get slightly different tones out of it, but it gives a very consistent sort of baseline tone. This has shown up in movies. Good example is the second Crocodile Dundee movie, where he actually uses it to make a phone call. He uses it as a signaling instrument. Now, I have actually tried to take these out into the real world and signal people set distances away. And the sound, though very intense, very loud and noticeable up close, does not travel well. I have not been able to get anybody to hear it more than about 100 yards away. Not to say that there aren't examples that were used that way or could have been, I just haven't been able to replicate them yet. Now, this is very much an outdoor musical instrument. And as you can see, I'm here surrounded in the museum by Ice Age skeletons, so I can't demonstrate this one. However, I have what used to be a bigger one for the exact reason that I just mentioned, outside musical instrument. And I can demonstrate how this works and hopefully get it loud enough that the microphone will pick this sound up. Give it a try here. Now the little one here, it just sort of buzzes. It almost sounds like a bumblebee flying by. The larger one makes a much longer, deeper tone. Important point, if you do try to make a bull roar, on these instruments, I use leather cord. It's very, very strong leather cord. It's the same stuff I make my clothing out of. The reason I do that is because it won't untwist. As I'm swinging this around and that paddle is twirling, eventually that paddle twirls until that string is twisted up as tight as it can in one direction. It pauses, goes quiet for a second, and then it starts spinning the other direction. If you're using string like this, standard garden twine, one direction, it will untwist. The other direction, it twists up real tight. So what happens is as you're swinging your bull roarer around, one direction, it twists that string up super tight and it gives you a really good crisp sound. It sounds great. The other direction, it untwists that string. And if your string is more than a couple feet long, which it needs to be for a bull roarer, you have splices in there where two ends of sections of fiber have been crossed together to give you a longer length of string. And when that happens, the string unravels and falls apart, and this piece goes flying across the living room like a shot, breaks a lamp, and Cave Wife tells us we have to play outside. So if you do look up and try to make a bull roarer, remember, outside musical instrument, you got to watch out for little brothers and sisters, the neighbor's dog, grandma's cat, cars on the street, you know, houses, airplanes overhead, that sort of thing. Because you don't want one of these to brain somebody. Now, with musical instruments that have been used for signaling over distance, that is actually a thing. Brings us to our second to last type of instruments here, horns. Now this is actually a shell, not a horn, but examples like this exist all over the world. And these are nice because they're ready-made, they're compact, they're very strong. It's hard to break a shell like this. To make this into a musical instrument, we simply grind the tip off. And this thing is hollow. It spirals around and wraps around itself. If I was to stretch this out into a straight line, it'd be about 3 feet long. These shells get very, very big. As you can see, I can actually fit my hand in there. Now, if I just take this through that hole and blow like I was through the flute, well, nothing happens. There's no vibration. This is just the resonance chamber, like the gourd on the bow. Now, if I buzz my lips, then I can make a good sound with this. Depending on how quickly or how tightly I do that, I can actually change the tone to some degree. Now, that wasn't a very good example, but you get the idea. I haven't been practicing enough with this. Now, an instrument like this can actually be used to signal over some distance. In fact, you might recognize something like this from movies about like Vikings and Middle Ages. This is actually why we call it a horn. They were originally made of horns. Now these are actual real live horns. These are from a large type of cow called an oxen, moo. And when they grow hollow. Now they're made of a material very much like our fingernails called keratin. But they grow hollow, they grow this shape, and just like the seashell, you just have to cut or grind off the tip of that to make it into a musical instrument like this. Now you can see I've adjusted the shape on the inside there to make it a little bit easier to use, but it's just been ground off. Now, way back at the beginning, I mentioned what I do for the museum. I take this stuff out and I try it out, I use it. And that's called experimental archaeology. The important part of that being experiment. An experiment is a method that science uses to answer a question. So we have our question, we have a theory about the reason for whatever our question is, about the answer. That's called our hypothesis. We take that hypothesis, we test it, and depending on the results, we either confirm that our theory, our guess as to the answer was correct, or it wasn't, and we need to figure something else out. Now, part of experimenting is, of course, testing these theories. Now, this is an experiment that did not work. Now, this is a horn. It's a cow horn, a little smaller, right? Cave wife calls this the fart horn. When I was trying to learn how these instruments work and trying to make them for myself for the first time, I cut this one too short across the top. You can see, it looks nice, but it's just not big enough. So if I you can see why Cave Wife calls this the fart horn. What's happened there is that it just doesn't have enough space for the sound to bounce back and forth before it leaves. It doesn't get to a proper resonance. Now, you take the bigger one, this can actually be heard for almost a mile on flat ground. If I get up onto the top of Rib Mountain, a big ski hill over here, you can hear this for 1.5 miles or more. It's got a really good sound and it carries. Now these, made with larger horns and slightly different ways, can actually be played as musical instruments, but they can also be used to signal other members of a group, say in a hunting party, if you've gotten the deer, or to start the chase, that sort of thing. Now, we've been looking a lot at musical instruments from the Stone Age and the Ice Age. And of course, this is just kind of an overview of instruments. There's thousands of different types of musical instruments from all over the world, from different cultures, different peoples. But if you want to make a very simple, very amusing musical instrument at your house, then you just need 2 things. A straw, and any straw, any soda straw from a fast food restaurant or wherever else, ice cream shop, wherever you get your straws, will do just fine. And a pair of scissors. Now, as you can see, this is just a plain old simple normal straw. If I take this straw and I blow through it, nothing happens. It's a straw, right? Now, what we want to do is flatten this out. So not the whole length of it, mind you, just the last inch or so, just a little bit of the end. And I know some people will do that with their teeth. My teeth don't like it if I do that with my teeth. So I'm going to use my fingernails and the scissors to just sort of put a crease in that to flatten it out. I would recommend doing something similar. You probably don't want to chew on a plastic straw. Your dentist will thank you if you don't. Now, once we've got it a little bit flattened like that, we take our scissors and we trim off a little bit from either side. And by a little bit, I mean about half, between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch, no more than that, so that you basically make it into a duckbill shape. Now, once you've done that, you want to get those cuts as even as you can. They don't have to be perfect, but once you've done that, when you blow through that straw, something different happens. You've produced that vibration that creates the sound, the basis for music. These little pieces, these little flaps, will clap together like an angry duck, and you get you get an angry duck. Now, if we want to take this and get different sounds out of it, there's a couple things you can do. The trickiest thing is to take the scissors and very carefully cut a little diamond-shaped hole out of the straw in a couple of places, like that. And that gives you those holes like in the flute. You can make different sounds with it. If you get a few of those in there, you can actually make, well, something music-like. It's probably music to a goose. Now, the easiest way to change the tone is actually just to cut the straw to a shorter length. Now, you do that, you've got your duck call. You can take your hand over the end and keep it kind of open. And depending on how you hold your hand, you can change that sound, that tone. You can get different noises. If you get one of these just right, I tell you from my own experience, you can in fact get ducks very confused about why you are such a strange looking duck. And they will sometimes even come over to you and look at you funny and quack back at you. Be careful with geese though. They're not very friendly usually. Now, I will say it can take a little bit of practice to get these right, to get the sound right, to get them to play right, but just a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of experimenting, and you can do this at home. And all it is a simple soda straw cut to the shape of a duck beak and flattened, and a little bit of your own breath. Now, I know we're coming up close to the end. I know I've talked about a lot of stuff here, gone over a lot of things tonight. Are there any questions from anybody who out there has been watching about any of this, or the musical instruments, or any of it in general? All right, well, excuse me, if there's no questions, then that's perfectly all right. I want to thank everybody for joining us here at Colossal Fossils tonight, and hopefully you enjoyed our, I'll call it attempts at Ice Age music and learning about some of these musical instruments. You know, music is one of those fantastic things that I wholeheartely encourage any of you go out and look into it. Check out some musical instruments. They don't have to be prehistoric, but music is an absolutely fantastic art form, and it's well worth spending a little time getting into. Library is a great place to find books on music and musical instruments, by the way. Now, again, thank you very much for joining me here at Colossal Fossils. We appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you all on the next programs. So thanks, everybody, and have a good night.